In this video, we're going to look at, this should say module 11.1 here. We're going to look at what are called Tibbles, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about importing data. Alright, so up to this point we've been primarily working with what are called data frames. Here we're going to introduce what are called Tibbles. So a Tibble is basically a table. And one thing to notice or note is that Tibbles are fairly new when it comes to R. So the longer that you work in R and the more that you do in R, what you're going to find out is R evolves pretty quickly. So when I first learned about R, we didn't work with Tibbles, and Tibbles are slowly becoming more popular, and the author of your textbook actually recommends that you work with Tibbles instead of data frames. So just keep in mind that R is always adding things and things are always kind of evolving. So Tibbles are data frames, but they have nicer properties, both in these notes and in the recommended text. Tibbles and data frames are going to pretty much be used interchangeably, and you'll see that they do have some similar properties. So we're going to go and we're going to look at the Tibble package, which is part of the Tidyverse. We've worked a lot with the Tidyverse up to this point. So the very first thing I'm going to do is call the Tidyverse. We're also going to look at that car seats data set. We have seen this before. It's part of the ISLR package. So again, I'm going to go ahead and call it, and we can always read about it as well. So if you'll remember, this is a simulated data set looking at the sale of car seats in 400 different stores, and there were several different variables here. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to check the current structure of car seats using the str function. And we'll see here that car seats is currently stored as a data frame. And we could view the car seats using view. We could coerce the data frame into a tibble. And so I'm going to name the object car seats underscore tib. And you'll notice we use the as underscore tibble function here. So it's a little bit different than the as dot that you've seen before. This function uses an underscore. So now if we look at the structure of car seats underscore tib, we see that now it's listed as a tibble. So versus the data frame that we saw earlier. We can also see that up here if we click down. We've got 400 observations of 11 variables, and for the tibble we also have 400 observations of 11 variables. Now notice by clicking the down, we don't see that one is stored as a data frame and one is scored as a tibble. We do need to use the structure function to do that, but we can see comparing across, we've got the same data in each of them. And then we could use the view function again, and notice if you click between the car seats tib and the car seats, they look the same. So data frames, tibbles, going to be very similar. So let's first look at how we could just create a brand new tibble. So to do this, we use the Tibble function, very similar to other functions that you have seen before. And to create the tibble, I'm going to give this one 3 arguments. I'm going to have x be equal to the numbers 6 through 10. Y is going to be equal to 1. So the first thing to notice here is notice that the length of x and y differ. And you're going to find out here soon that Tibbles don't allow that. So we're going to see what happens to y. And then my last thing I have here is name, and I have 5 different names. So let's run this. And so you'll notice that x is the number 6 through 10. Since y only had length 1, what it did was it repeated y 6 times. So this column is all 1s, and then we have, repeated y 5 times, not 6. And then we have the 5 names as well. So this is very similar to when we created data frames. So a little bit about the difference. So in contrast to data frames, Tibble does much less. It's never going to change the type of inputs. So in other words, it's never going to convert a string to factor. So data frames would automatically do that. Remember, we'd have to go and check and see, is this stored as a factor? Is it not? Tibbles are never going to do that. So in some ways, it's not as nice because it isn't automated, but it is really nice because you have more control. You know exactly what you read in, and if you need it to be a factor, you can do the conversions. It is never going to change the names of variables, and it's never going to create row names. So sometimes what will happen is variable names will get changed if they're invalid variable names. So let's say they start with an underscore, for example, an X will be placed in front of them automatically. Tibbles don't actually do that. So Tibbles will allow for those non-standard names that we've seen before, and here in a moment we'll look at how those are handled. Alright, so as I was just saying, it's possible for a Tibble to have column names that are not valid R variable names. So to refer to these variables, you need to surround them with backticks. And I think that we have seen examples like this before by accident, and so let's look at this. So for example, if I wanted to create a new Tibble, I'm going to name this one Tibble1. I'm going to use that Tibble function that we just saw. Alright, so let's say that I wanted my object to have this name right here, so a colon and then an open parentheses, in other words a frowny face. Well, this is not a name that R will allow typically. So what I've done here is I've surrounded it with backticks, and so backticks are generally in the very upper left hand corner of your keyboard. And then I'm going to set this object be equal to frown. Remember that R will also not allow variable names to start with a number. Well, here if I wanted to name the variable 101 Dalmatians, again I could surround it by the backticks. And then let's say I just wanted the variable name to be a space, and again so here I've got a space inside the backticks. So running this, then if I just wanted to look at Tibble1, notice here's Tibble1, and we can see that the name for the first variable is that symbol for a smiley face. The name for the second one is 101 Dalmatians, and the name for the last one is the space. And notice that these are surrounded by the backticks, and that's what allows this to occur. So if we want to call one of those variables from the data set, we can use the $sign notation that we've used previously with data frames. But now, when I call that variable name, I have to make sure I include the backticks. So what I've done here is I've created a table of the Tibble. And so if we just called this by itself, here's what we would have. Calling the table lets me see that each of the names are included in the variable one time. You can also create what's called a transpose table, and this is using the Tibbles function. So transpose tables, how these work is the very first thing you're going to give it are the names of the variables. And you'll notice here we have the tilde in front of them. So I have names, age, and weights. And then below it, you'll have each of those in order for each of the observations. If you've ever worked in SAS, this is very similar to how the data lines in SAS works. So if we run this, notice here is the Tibble that it creates, and again across the top we have our variable names, and then we have each of the observations following. Alright, so a little bit more about the comparison between data frames and Tibbles. There's two main differences in the usage of a Tibble versus a classic data frame. It's printing and subsetting. So Tibbles are really nice for printing because they have a refined print method that shows only the first 10 rows and all of the columns that fit into a screen. So to see this, what I'm going to type here, and I'll leave this in here in your script, is let's go back to that car seats data set that we looked at earlier. Notice if I just call car seats, which we saw earlier was a data frame, if I print these, notice we get a reached max. I've made it 310 rows because it can't print all the rows because there were 400 observations in this data set. On the other hand, if I call car seats tib, the Tibble version, by default the Tibble is only going to run the first couple rows. So it makes it a little bit easier and keeps you from accidentally just printing huge amounts of data in your console. So here's another example. Here I'm going to create a Tibble. I'm going to let A be equal to the numbers 1 to 1000. What I'm doing here is I'm using the Lubridate package and I'm calling the function now from it. And essentially what this is going to do is this is going to pull the date and time for right now, and then I'm going to add a little bit of error onto it. I'm going to use the today function as well. So let's run this. So notice here again, it's only going to print the first 5 lines, even though this tibble has 1,000, and we can see that right here. And you'll notice here for A, I have the numbers 1 through 5. For B, I'm making this today on the so looking here at the date, we have the date, and then this is plus or minus, just a little bit of randomness, so they're not all exactly the same. And then same thing with this date right here. Alright, so again, Tibbles are designed so that you don't accidentally overwhelm your console when you print large data frames. Now you can control the default. So to do that, you would do the options call. And so if we look here at the options call, so what this line of code is doing, if we look at the tibble.print_max, what this is saying is if there are more than this number of rows, or in this case 15, if there are more than 15, then only print 5. And so you'll notice I actually ran this earlier, and so that's why we've been seeing 5 lines when I run this. But we could up this, let's say, to 10. And notice I'll get 10 by default now when I call any of my Tibbles. So I could call car seats as well, and I will get 10. So you can set this option for however many you want it to print by default. Subsetting is another difference. So if we create a new table, so here I'm going to call this Tibble 2. And so you'll notice in this Tibble, if we run this, I've got 5 different names, 5 different ages, and 5 different heights. We can extract columns similar to what we did before. So we could use the $sign to get age, and we can also use the double brackets. So these are very similar in terms of subsetting to the data frames that you've seen before. The one difference being the double brackets here, but we've used the $sign many times before. And then here we can also use, just take out this piece right here. You can also use these in a pipe operator. So here we're going to take the Tibble 2 and we're going to filter it so we only see the ages greater than 10. And so you'll notice here we have Tibble 2 and we only have those observations that had an age greater than 10. So again, for the most part, they act very, very similar to data frames. They're just a newer version. My guess is eventually, when it comes to working in R, Tibbles will probably eventually replace data frames. So, and that's just kind of the evolution of R and how things go. But again, you'll see that they are very, very similar to one another. All right, so the last thing that I want to talk about here is just a little bit about data importing. So most of the times when I import data, it's in the form of a CSV. And so that's why most of the time we use the import.csv or the read.csv function rather. But there are lots and lots of different ways that you can read in data. So chapter 11 in your textbook talks about several different read functions. So there's the read CSV, there's what's called a read FWF, which stands for read fixed with files. There's read logs. There's all different kinds of files that you can read into R. And there's a whole different, all kinds of functions. One package that you probably want to be aware of is what is called the Rio function, and I'm going to let you read this on your own. But the Rio is a really nice function for importing files because it'll let you import files in almost any format using typically a single argument function. So if you know for your research that you're going to be reading in lots of different types of files in different formats, then I would really suggest checking out this Rio package. So that is going to conclude the video for this note set. So as always, if you have any questions, please let me know.